Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks so much for joining us. We're back from an extended 6 weeks holidays. I really needed it. I'm back and I'm happy to be back and happy to be with you. And my first guest after the holidays is an old good friend of mine, Dennis Small, the executive director for Executive Intelligence Review Latin American Desk, and he's also the director of the Schiller Institute. Dennis, thanks so much for joining us. And again, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much. Always good to be back, Daniel. Look forward to this chat.
I think, you and I always have so much fun talking about things. We have a plan, things we want to talk about, then we go off somewhere in left field. We come back to the things we want to talk about. But I think people really enjoy it. So let me ask you this. There's a lot to discuss. The upcoming Trump-Putin summit in Alaska on August 15th bears the potential of becoming what?
Well, the potential is enormous, not so much because of the meeting per se, but because this is a pregnant moment of history, meaning it's a moment of enormous change with a system that is in a breakdown crisis in many different aspects, many different ways, and the extraordinarily dangerous situation which has developed out of the NATO war against Russia on Ukrainian territory and out of the ongoing mess in the Middle East with this unbelievable genocide being carried out by the Netanyahu government with full backing, or pretty close to full backing, by London and Washington. These are all reflections of a very profound crisis. And here you have the heads of state of Russia and the United States to meet in Alaska. There's a lot on the table. I'm not sure when this discussion of ours will be coming out, if before or after, but I honestly don't think anyone can really...
It's going to be out. We're going to try to make it out on Friday, the day of the meeting. Today is Wednesday, okay, the 13th of August, and we're going to try to give a very quick turnaround, translate this into Spanish and have it out by Friday in 2 days.
Yeah, that would be great. I'm still not going to make any forecast really of what's going to happen there. I don't think anyone knows. But your question wasn't what's going to happen. Your question is what's the potential?
Right.
And the potential is really great because you have a situation where if the United States, under pressure, blackmail, and direction from the British in particular, as occurred 100% with Biden and with a lot of pressure on the Trump government, which way to go. If they continue pulling towards a confrontation with Russia, this is going to get very nasty. There are no arms agreements left between the two countries. The president of the United States, Trump, said he would be deploying 2 nuclear-capable submarines closer to Russia. There's always 4 on patrol, as you know, but putting 2 closer in simply means that it shortens time with the depressed ballistic trajectory to 7-8 minutes before they strike Moscow, which leaves the authorities in Moscow a minute or two to make a decision as to what to do. And as a result, the Russians have done a couple of things. One is they have announced that they will no longer be following the requirements of the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty,
right,
which the United States pulled out of. And
in 2019, yep.
Yeah, and is positioning intermediate range weapons all around Russia. Russia had been abiding by it, but they say no more. And then the other thing that they're doing is they're readying serial production of Oreshnik hypersonic missile systems, which are capable of reaching not only every capital of Europe, but every United States military base in Europe and in the Middle East in 5, 7, 8 minutes as well. So we're absolutely on a hair trigger if something isn't done to bring this back down to a situation of negotiations on peace, but most especially cooperation for development. Now, the fact that the meeting is being held in Alaska is interesting in itself. I don't know whose idea that was. I have my suspicions, but I don't know. But it definitely opens up prospects because it's the perfect place, as 𝐤𝐮𝐬𝐻, the founder of the Schiller Institute, just put out in a statement a couple of days ago, for Putin and Trump to sit down and discuss the building of a tunnel under the Bering Strait for high-speed rail and other forms of communication and industrial development as a first great project step towards the countries cooperating for development as opposed to heading in a trajectory towards confrontation, which will conceivably end with the annihilation of the whole human race.
I wanted to ask you about this because 𝐻𝐿GA LaRouche, Lyndon LaRouche's wife, as you said, she made an urgent appeal to President Trump, President Putin, but also to Chairman Xi Jinping. What's the crux of the appeal?
The crux of the appeal, it's a double appeal. One is for the August 15th meeting between Putin and Trump saying, gentlemen, please, let's discuss, put this Bering Strait tunnel idea on the table. And it's not a simple superficial thing, as I'm sure we'll discuss. This goes way back in Russian and Soviet history and American history. It's been a long-standing dream of forward-looking forces on both sides. It's been a very active policy discussion. Lyndon LaRouche promoted this idea going back to 1978. They're leading figures, and really leading figures, in Russia, China, and the United States who have been all for this. So there's that. But the other side of the proposal is that, look, the 80th celebration of the end of World War II, the defeat of fascism, will be held in Beijing for the victory in the Pacific on September 3rd. Putin has already announced he's going to be there. The Chinese may or may not have invited Trump. We have good reason to believe that they sounded it out. We think that Xi Jinping should issue an invitation. We think Trump should go. And we think this is the perfect occasion for these three principal nations, not to exclude others, but as a nucleus around which others can congregate, that they should go back to the kind of alliance which defeated Nazism in World War II and defeated Japanese militarism in World War II. Remember, we were allies, the Soviets, the United States.
And not only in World War II, also in the Civil War.
Going back to the Civil War, the Russians came to help Lincoln very greatly. And there are numerous occasions. If you go way back in history, Leibniz's trip to Russia to develop the ideas of cooperation between Europe and Russia, the Russian Empire at the time, and so on. So there's plenty of history to this. But in the current situation, we have the ability, if great leaders can come together, and they would be great, all three of them, if they did this, to return to the kind of approach which guided Franklin Delano Roosevelt in World War II, and which guided the alliance to defeat fascism and Nazism at that time. This is a very real question, Daniel, because the same causes of that fascism or Nazism then have reared their ugly head today. And this is a very, very real danger. You have a collapsing financial system driving towards militaristic economies, just like Schacht did in Germany under British guidance. And we have Schachtian economics being implemented all across Europe, like with Merz and others. The same policies proposed for the United States. And those policies lead toward war. So this, and then if you look at the Ukraine situation, you see literally Nazi forces around the Azov Brigade and the right sector and so on, who are followers of Stepan Bandera, who was the ally of Adolf Hitler during World War II. And those are the forces that actually control the Zelensky government, fully funded, fully backed, fully endorsed by the NATO allies. So we really are at a kind of crossroads, and its roots have to do with a breakdown financial crisis.
So let me ask you, let me pick it up from, because you made a very interesting point, which I thought of myself, speaking of the crossroads. If we are the crossroads, and I totally agree with you, I think we are, what happens if we choose the wrong pathway?
Well, the serious possibilities are that this could escalate into an actual nuclear confrontation by error and miscalculation, or also by intention. The error and miscalculation piece is much easier for people to understand and to agree that, yes, that's a possibility, because there have been near misses in the past, not because anyone wanted to start a war, but because we had taken things so close to the brink that any slight miscalculation, and put yourself in the shoes of Putin, and you get a report from your system, your AI coordinated intercept system that you've got incoming, and you've got 7 minutes, 5 minutes, and you got to figure out, is this the real thing? Is this a mistake? Is this a test? What's going on? Do I push the button or not? So, and there have been numerous cases in history, recorded history, of errors of miscalculation where we were very close. What people have a lot more trouble wrapping their mind around, as the saying goes, is the fact that there is actually a very powerful, very dangerous faction in the governing elites, especially in London, but also throughout NATO, who view launching and fighting a nuclear war as something that can be launched and won. They are actually planning for warfare. They think that they could conceivably get away with what's called a decapitation strike, whereas you launch without letting anyone know, there's no time, and you decapitate the leadership and the military capabilities. Sort of what they tried to do with Iran, with partial success. And there are open advocates of this. Generals in the United States Army, General Donahue, who's head of the military, the ground components of NATO in Europe, has said, well, we're certainly considering the possibility, and these are prospects, and we have to study. There was Admiral Buchanan, also CENTCOM, who said, listen, we have to prepare to fight and win a nuclear war. And then you get active promotion of this idea. And this is where it starts to get into the depths of the policymakers. Someone like Malcolm Chalmers. Malcolm Chalmers was, until recently, the deputy director of RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute.
Right.
This is the longest standing monarchical think tank. This is as old and monarchical as you can get. And what he proposed right at the beginning of the Ukraine developments is that the West should play nuclear chicken with Russia on Crimea, and to create a Cuban Missile Crisis on steroids, quote unquote. In fact, you and I may have discussed this on an earlier show, because this was a number of years ago. That same Malcolm Chalmers is no longer with RUSI. He is now the top strategic advisor to the Defense Secretary of the United Kingdom. And he has played a major role as well in the recently redefined and adopted British defense strategy document. So you're talking about people who think that, we could do this, we could catch them by surprise, we could launch a war, and we've got a good chance of winning. Tucker Carlson, who has a fairly large audience on national TV to his 4 million people or whatever, reported that he had been told by people in the Pentagon, this is about 6 months ago, when Tucker asked them, but have you considered the possibility that what you're planning to do by shipping Patriots and Tauruses and long-range missiles into Russia, and then the provocations which have occurred, that this could actually lead to nuclear war? And Tucker Carlson reported that that Pentagon person said, yes, we got intelligence reports from the CIA and elsewhere, and their estimate was that there was a 50-50 chance that that would happen.
Now, how close are we to extinction, Dennis, if you really think about it?
50-50? I mean, is that a gamble you want to take with nuclear extinction? Would
you take, if this is a question not only to you, but to all about 500,000 people who are going to see this interview. If we're in a casino, okay, and you're playing blackjack, and it's, 50-50, it's do or die, and you have about $100,000, that's all the money you have. You, your family, your mom, your dad, your granddaddy, who gave you some money before you died, your wife's money. You have $100,000, okay? And you have a 50-50, are you going to take it? Because if you lose, your ass is grass. And we're not talking about nuclear confrontation with the annihilation of 3 or 4 billion people.
Yeah, no, it's a different. I mean, the scale of it is enormous. The comparison is.
But they're willing to take the risk where a normal person with $100,000 measly dollars is not going to take that risk.
But the reason for that, no, that's true. I mean, that's absolutely true. But the reason for that, and this is what people have trouble wrapping their heads around, is that they are the people who run a dying system, a system which is in a collapse just as much as the Soviet Union was in collapse in 1989. The whole thing is coming down. The finances, the economics, the social system, the morals, everything is coming down, or just as much as the Middle Ages were coming down around the Black Death. And that's a system which has about $2 quadrillion in speculative assets. Today, we heard the news reports that the U.S. debt has just risen to 37 trillion.
Right.
Well, that's pretty impressive, but that ain't peanuts, because the world debt is one order of magnitude larger.
I remember Lyndon many years ago was talking about $4 quadrillion.
Well, maybe 1 quadrillion, but it's now over 2 as best we can guess. But, between 1, 2, and 4, it's unpayable.
It doesn't matter. Exactly. It's unpayable. Yeah.
It's totally unpayable. So, but the point of those financial assets, which are largely derivatives, is that that's an order of magnitude greater still than the total world debt. So it's completely illiquid. It's totally insolvent.
Right.
These geniuses in the City of London and Wall Street, instead of saying, hey, why don't we just figure out a way to cooperate with countries that also want to develop, like the BRICS and the Russians and the Chinese, they're willing to do that. They say, no, we're going to bail this bubble out come hell or high water, and it'll probably be hell. And their entire policy is based on what I call crypto tariffs, because the crypto policy and the tariff policy is the same thing.
Yep.
And it's designed, in fact, by the same people. Lutnick, who is the Commerce Secretary in the United States government, is the guy who reportedly sold Trump on the idea of cryptocurrency and stable coins and so on, which is wildly speculative. And he's also the one who's been behind this tariff policy, which the only thing that it's going to do, I mean, I will give you a forecast, not around Alaska, but one thing that's going to do, number one, you're going to cause defaults right and left throughout the developing sector. Debt moratoria defaults, because countries pay their debts with the income they get from exports. You cut back the exports because there are these gigantic tariffs, 50%, 100%, 30%. They're going to suffer income drop-offs. And there are some countries, like Egypt, who have a debt service ratio of 30%. 30% of their exports goes to pay the debt. So it's pretty clear. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to realize that this is going to lead to blowouts. But that blowout is only the fuse on the bigger blowout. The other thing that's going on, just to finish the concept on this, cryptocurrencies. I mean, look, in 2008, near blowout of the system, they started quantitative easing. Okay, what was quantitative easing? Funny money, backed by nothing. It did not go into productive credit. It went to bail out the bubble.
Right.
Total cumulative quantitative easing over since 2008 from the Fed, the BCE, and so on. The ECB, sorry, I'm speaking.
Got it. Yeah, I understand.
Is about 27 trillion. A tidy sum, but not that huge compared to the bubble. And then it peaked. It stopped being able to do what it wanted. They are now talking, Daniel, the people doing the cryptocurrency, of unleashing between now and 2030, if we get there, approximately between 100 trillion and $200 trillion in cryptocurrency. Now, cryptocurrency isn't funny money. It's really funny money. It's issued by private individuals. It's not even issued by a central bank. It's not backed by anything. Any Tom, Dick, and Harry can issue cryptocurrency. And
I mean, the system is totally corrupt. I think the global economic collapse, it's as you said, it's affecting the entire world. You have financial problems in the West, and they've become only part of this overall process, which is more and more reminiscent of the beginning of the Soviet collapse back in the 1980s. You have the falling birth rate, you have sharp increase in drug addictions, you have sexual depravities and degeneracies, you have a sharp drop in the level of education, a categorical unwillingness to fight for an ideal, and these are becoming commonplace. And then if you add the inevitable destruction of state social support system in almost every Western country, then it becomes clear that today's world and its system of values has a zero chance of surviving for much longer and will require, I'd say, far-reaching and sweeping planetary reforms. But do we have a language? I don't mean English, Spanish, Russian, or Mandarin. Do we have a language of economics to explain what these reforms are going to look like?
Well, we do. I mean, because we're human beings. And what I mean by that is not sort of a platitude and looking at the world through rose-tinted glasses, because just as there are people talking about pumping 100 trillion of money which was printed by Tom, Dick, and Harry, which is then going to go bankrupt, and then you can try to collect from Tom, Dick, and Harry if you can find them, with no backing whatsoever. But the human economy, our economy, the economy in the world, is based on advances in science and technology, which leads to increases in industrialization, productivity, and so on. Over the recorded history of mankind, that's what's functioned. Whatever the ideological system was, capitalism, socialism, communism, neither, both, that kind of advance in science and technology is what has driven physical economy forward. The source of that is the ability of the human mind, again, whatever the language and culture, to be creative, to be able to come up with concepts and ideas that are new based on looking at what's going on around you and coming up with new creative concepts. Now, that's what the spark inside all human beings actually is. Some people call it soul. That's a good word for it. I'll go for that. But that has not been wiped out. And so if we can get a shift into the kind of economic policy which develops those capabilities in people and opens prospects, it's a totally different situation. Let me give you an example. I have a map or a couple of graph or two that I want to share here.
Yeah.
Let me see if this is going to work. You have to.
Yeah, I'm going to share the screen with you. Hang on a second. Oops.
Allow me to do share
multiple
screen.
Hang on a second. I'm going to turn this off. One sec. Share the screen. Multiple participants. Yeah, go ahead.
There we go. Okay, let me find it. All right. Now this is a world map. Are you seeing it there? I'm not.
No, I'm not seeing. I started screen sharing. Double click to enter full screen mode. No, but I'm not seeing a map. Ah, there it is. Yeah, el puente terrestre mundial. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. This isn't the Spanish version of the map.
Doesn't matter.
But nonetheless, it's very clear. This is the world land bridge. This is something which the LaRouche movement developed going back decades. It's very similar to the ideas subsequently put in action by the Chinese government. But what it points to is the concept of global industrial and infrastructure development. And in particular, a series of major great infrastructure projects, which are game changers. You'll see that number one on the list here is the tunnel through the Bering Strait. And this has been studied going back centuries, actually. It's 100 kilometers. It's not far. It's absolutely doable. And the point would be to link up the high-speed rail lines which have developed and exist all across Eurasia, especially thanks to the Chinese, extending all the way into Europe, but to link that up with similar developments in the United States, Alaska, Canada, the United States, going down through Mexico.
I just want to bring up a point that a lot of people seem to miss. Russia and the United States are not that far apart, okay? Because the Bering Strait separates Alaska, which used to be Russian, now it's American, from mainland Russia. And it's only 100 kilometers apart. That's how close these two countries are. They're closer than what Spain is to England or what Spain is to Paris. Madrid to Paris is farther than Russia from the United States, just so we understand.
Yep. And that's, for those who are not familiar with kilometers, that's maybe 60 miles, something
exactly.
like that.
Yeah.
And there are two little islands in the middle, the big Diomede and little Diomede, so it makes it easy. They're stepping stones and so on. But they're countries that are united by a problem to be solved. It's an engineering problem, which is not the biggest deal in the world. The channel was built to link the UK to France. There have been extensive discussions of Gibraltar to link, and these are engineering studies, completely feasible, to link Spain to Morocco. The Italian government, number 7 here, has just adopted as official government policy, and they will be funding this, the Messina Bridge to connect mainland Italy to Sicily, which was a long-standing project which has existed. These kinds of projects create the basis for rapid advances in technology and development. In South America, since I know a large part of your audience, Daniel, is Spanish speaking and is in South America, the idea of, besides opening the Darien Gap, number two, Chancay Port in Peru, which the Chinese government has built and now exists, and it is the major port in all South America, capable of handling huge bulk carriers and container ships and so on, vastly improving the productivity of shipping across the Pacific. What's now under discussion, which is necessary, is building a bioceanic railroad, which I've highlighted in sort of a turquoise light blue. Brazil is discussing this with China. They're going into the feasibility studies. It follows exactly on one of the courses, which we had mapped out here, which would open up the entire interior of the continent to development. And the same holds for the Russia-United States question. The Russia-United States question has greater strategic significance because it could put our two countries on a pathway towards a shared welfare looking into the future. If you start to bring about those changes, Daniel, that's then the basis from which the kinds of underlying moral, cultural, spiritual problems that you're talking about can be addressed and solved. And they must be, they have to be solved. But it's only if you get society on an upward path of progress that the state of mind that accompanies that upward path becomes accessible to people. You put people in an economic jungle, and they will start thinking like they're in the law of the jungle. They'll start thinking like Hobbes. They'll start thinking like Adam Smith. They'll start thinking like animals. So that's why such a project as this is so important, both for the strategic significance of it, but also because of how this could serve, especially if China were brought in to connect its policies of the Belt and Road Initiative to what would be a global policy. And the BRICS would, join in a half second if this were offered to them to this kind of approach, to not have a confrontation and a tariff fight, but instead to actually cooperate on development.
There's 2 points I wanted to make. First is I agree that we absolutely are at the crossroads. And I think the roads we take now will determine whether we live in the 21st century, Dennis, as nation-state republics or subjugated, cold, and dehumanized crop of slaves. That's point number one. And point number two, going back to the Putin-Trump talks, I think the first, at the highest level, where the main agenda will not be a bilateral relations as much as exploring the positions of alliance, both Western and non-Western. So if you look at the global situation, I think it becomes clear, one, that it's increasingly heterogeneous, and two, that the further it progresses, the more the military force component appears. And these processes are, they're objective, and they're associated with the, I'd say, collapse of the system of this global interdependence and real regionalization. And the regionalization has been postponed for a long time, and now quantity is giving way to quality. So we've gone from globalization, and the next phase is regionalization of global economy. In fact, we're seeing it with Brexit and BRICS, the first two attempts at regionalizing the world economy. And so everything we see now in terms of armed conflicts, military escalation fits perfectly into the concept of this geoeconomics of power, when instruments of power that go beyond hybrid wars are used to achieve competitive spatial economic advantages. Do you see it like this, or there's
I would add one element in that I think is key to rounding out the picture, and that is that the current system is in a complete breakdown crisis.
Right.
That is to say, it functions on the basis of value being determined by the market price of something, and therefore you have this gigantic speculative bubble which is viewed as having as much value. $1 million invested in derivatives is worth the same $1 million invested in steel or nuclear energy. whereas clearly they don't have the actual same value. They may have the same price. So we have a system which has this gigantic cancerous debt bubble sitting on top of it. And unless we have a policy of ridding ourselves of that, which of course Lyndon LaRouche developed over decades of work, Glass-Steagall legislation in the United States, for the BRICS countries, they have to necessarily establish a fixed exchange rate system with no free convertibility into the dollar. That's like just opening the doors to the cancer. And so you have to have a system where you have a return to a fixed system like we had in 1971, and then credit generating mechanisms and institutions so that you can actually start the process of physical economic recovery. That, I think, is the crucial question that gives shape to the kind of stuff that you're talking about. Now, it's interesting. I found it very interesting before Helga Zepp-LaRouche or anyone on our side said anything about this. The Russians were talking about the Bering Strait in joint development with the United States. Ushakov, Yuri Ushakov, the principal international advisor to Putin, followed by Kirill Dmitriev, who is the special envoy for negotiations with the United States. Both talked about, well, maybe we should sit down and figure out what economic cooperation we can have. And it is generally known that Dmitriev actually is a real partisan in favor of the Bering Strait project. So this is interesting. This is useful. I'm not saying this is going to happen like magic, but if you then go back to the United States, look, many of your viewers may not remember because it goes back a ways, but there was a governor from the state of Alaska whose name was Wally Hickel. He was governor twice, and then he was Commerce Secretary once. Hickel was an adamant proponent, he was from Alaska, of the Bering Strait Tunnel. He championed the whole idea. And his motto was, why should we have war? Why not have a big project? Now, that's a pretty tight summary. Now, one would imagine why the Russians would want to do this. The interesting thing that gives this some real legs is the fact that the Chinese are really in on the idea. I'll mention two things for information for your viewers. Number one, there was a conference held in Moscow in April 2007, which was a seminar on the Bering Strait Tunnel and the prospects for it. From the Russian side, it was sponsored by the SOPS, which I told translates roughly into the Council for the Study of Productive Forces. This is a long-standing Soviet and then Russian institution for long-term planning. And its head, Gronberg, was a very active proponent of the Bering Strait Tunnel. Lyndon LaRouche was invited and sent a presentation on why this was so important for both countries. So he was an active participant in this thing. From that same meeting, 2007, a video was prepared on the Bering Strait Tunnel, which 3 years later in 2010 at the Shanghai World Export in China in 2010 won the grand prize for innovation. So the Chinese were really interested in this. And then Wang Menshu, which is not a name I had known particularly well until recently, who is probably the leading tunnel expert in all of China. He's passed away, but he was very active. And he gave an interview to the New York Times in 2014 saying, we're building tunnels. We're building one over the Bohai Bay. It's going to be the longest in the world. We could absolutely do the same thing in the Bering Strait. We should do it. It's in the interest of China. It's in the interest of Russia. And this is what he said. Some governments like to spend their resources on fighting wars. I think building a railway is far more meaningful than fighting wars.
Let me ask you, you mentioned the Bering Strait Tunnel proposal. Lynn has been the advocate for many, many years. I don't know exactly at what point in the 70s or 80s he became the proponent, but how does this fit together with this whole idea of the world land bridge proposal which you just showed us on a map? Because I know he often insists that he was not just proposing rail lines and transport links and corridors, but in fact, high-tech corridors of industrial development. And now, as we're coming into the sixth technological paradigm, artificial intelligence, robotics, et cetera, how does that fit into this industrial development as the world turns into a completely new dimension? What's the difference?
The transport corridors are not simply connecting point A with point B, and that it's good for A and it's good for B. Look at the history of the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States, which Lincoln built.
Right.
Look at the history of the Trans-Siberian in the Soviet Union. Railroads bring development, and especially if you conceive of these as industrial development corridors, as LaRouche always proposed, with 100 kilometers on each side of the rail line, with fiber optic cables, with factories, with building new cities, with nuclear power plants. In other words, almost like conveyor belts of technological advance that gets pumped into the economy. The reason he thought of it this way, and why it's useful to distinguish between that concept and just point A to point B and having a rail line, is that the driving force in economic development is, and always has been and always will be, technological innovation. It's not simply doing more of the same.
Right.
It's good to do more of the same. If you've got, I wish we had some high-speed rail in the United States. We don't have any.
We don't have any, exactly.
Zero, flat out zero. The Chinese are at 40,000 kilometers going up to 50. So that's an existing technology, although they're moving ahead with vacuum tubes and magnetic levitation and a whole series of new things. But real technological advance isn't simply doing more of something that was already successful. The reason is that if you do that, you're going to exhaust your resource base. So instead of having the view of the Club of Rome and limits to growth and the Malthusians, as you well know, Lyndon LaRouche's view was always, well, man, unlike any other species, is endowed with a capability of creative thinking and therefore technological advance. And as you exhaust your existing resource base with one technological platform, you have to jump to a new one, especially as you see in the energy field. So you go from biomass to coal to oil to fission power to fusion power to matter-antimatter. And mankind is always moving forward by those kinds of leaps. The World Lange Bridge is to be thought of as a mechanism for bringing that about, not connecting point A and point B, but as a way of bringing that flow of revolutionary new ideas in science and in culture and make it available to all of mankind, so that you could travel not only by rail, but you could go from Tierra del Fuego at the tip of South America all the way up through the United States, across over to Russia, down through the Eurasian landmass to Gibraltar, cross over to Africa, and go all the way down to Cape Horn. Now, this is not to eliminate national sovereignty. This is to create the conditions in which every nation, every people, as a sovereign nation, can contribute to the well-being of all of mankind. And the Schiller Institute, which Helga Zepp-LaRouche heads, and I've been involved in for many, many decades, is based on the great German philosopher, playwright, scientist Friedrich Schiller, one of whose most famous comments was, one has to be both a patriot of one's own nation and a world citizen at the same time. And I think that kind of captures the crisis that we're facing. Either we do that and we make that leap, or we are going to end up with a very possible nuclear war. And I think Alaska could well be a decisive turning point in that battle.
Let me ask you, we have time for one more question. What's in it for the global South? Because in the end, even if Xi Jinping, Putin, and Trump do meet, okay, you have the BRICS, you have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and so they're wondering what's in it for me. So what's in it for the global South in general, with the Bering proposal or the World Lange Bridge in general?
Well, what isn't in it for the global South with such a proposal? Right now, they're staring down the barrel of a collapsing system, which they are hooked to through the dollar system. They're trying to find ways to de-dollarize and put some distance. That's all fine and good. You got to do that. If there's cancer knocking at your door, you close the door. But they desperately need, more than anybody else, look at the continent of Africa. It's going to be the biggest population center of the world within a couple of decades. And so the idea of technological advance and industrial development, where East and West cooperate in the development of the South, that's the kind of situation which works for the BRICS. And if the United States, under a President Lincoln, he would have done it. Under a Roosevelt, he would have, LaRouche would have, simply say to the Chinese and Russians, we'll cooperate. You'll see our system will be better than yours, but let's cooperate. And to then say to the South, we want to work with you to help you develop, not to destroy you with speculation, debt, drugs, the migrant problem, but take the migrant problem. If you have development in Central America and Mexico with industrial projects and so on, people aren't going to be fleeing to the United States to stay alive. They will want to stay and develop their country. And you can solve both the migrant problem and the drug problem, incidentally, by wiping that out through development of this sort. So I see this as a very fluid situation with changes going on in the West, in the East, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The BRICS is moving. They will not take these tariffs lying down. So I think that this is, as I said at the very outset, this is a pregnant moment. And of course, one can always have stillborn results from a pregnancy, or one can produce a new form of life. And I think we really are at that kind of optimistic crossroads.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. Before we go, how can people follow Executive Intelligence Review, Schiller Institute? How can we help? If someone wants to contribute, how can they do this? The floor is yours.
Okay. Well, for subscriptions to Executive Intelligence Review, to get a strategic briefing on the kinds of things that are going on a daily basis, there's a very simple website to go to. It's EIR.news. And you can get a monthly subscription for $10 or €10 if you're in Europe and you want it in German. Other than that, go to schillerinstitute.org and you will find the links there for all of the kinds of policies and discussions we've been talking about, including this latest proposal that we began with, 𝐤𝐿GA LaRouche's call for the Bering Strait Tunnel to be on the agenda at Alaska, and for then Trump, Putin, and Xi Jinping to meet together on September 3rd in Beijing around these same ideas. And that's a call of hers, which has 20 pages of documentation taken from the pages of EIR going back to 1978. 78 is the year that LaRouche first proposed.
There are so many other wonderful resources you guys have. Fidelio, for example, going back to the early 1990s, if I'm not mistaken. I used to love that magazine. Anyway, it's Executive Intelligence Review. For me, is one of the absolutely best sources of information out there. And Vladimir Putin, I think, one of the top 3 or 4 or 2 or 3, not only personalities or political figures, but relevant figures on the world stage as far as global politics is concerned. He died. When did he die exactly? 2017 or?
No, 2019.
2019. He was 97 or 8 years old.
Right.
I had a pleasure of meeting. He was a wonderful man, brilliant man. So anyway, Dennis, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, and especially thank you for your endorsement of EIR.news. And
you guys deserve.
If I can say one last comment.
Yep.
People should not just be observers. Don't be.
Exactly.
Act.
Participate. Yes. Do not be an observer.
Yeah. Don't listen to Daniel Estulin just to see what he has to say and isn't that interesting and get good ideas.
Participate.
Use it to act politically, however you see fit. That's what I would.
Don't spend your money on a stupid milkshake from Starbucks. Spend it to become wiser, more intelligent, more human.
Fair enough.
Thanks a lot.
EIR.news. Thanks, Daniel. Always
take care. Bye-bye.